This is the first time I'm writing this out, so forgive me if there's any punctual errors. I've had several encounters with Dogman for the past 10 years of my life, being out and about in multiple different states across multiple different terrains. I don't know what it is. It's like once you see one, it just opens the floodgates for continuous encounters with these things. My last encounter was only a few months ago, before the quarantine. My first being almost 10 years ago, and since then, I've had my fair share of dealing with these creatures. When I talk about opening the floodgates, when you have your first encounter, it's almost as if you're flagged. It seems that no matter where you are, they will find ways to come out of the woodworks to pay you a visit. I know I'm not crazy on that, because I've heard of other people's experiences being very similar, being on a handful of Vic Hundif's show. My very first encounter with these creatures was back in 2011, where a friend and I decided to go far into the national forest. I believe it was the Angelina National Forest in Texas. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it shouldn't be too far from that location. This friend and I hiked through many forests back in the day, and would like to think of ourselves as woodsmen. I'm familiar with all types of wildlife across North America. I know various tracks, sounds, and calls of many animals. I know for a fact I was actually experiencing an animal that isn't known to exist. My friend and I had followed this old game trail, and for probably 3 or 4 miles. Thick wilderness on both sides of us. My friend all of a sudden stops, both of us, and does the shh finger to his lips. I'm quiet, and I notice everything around me is silent. My friend staring intently at me, trying to listen for anything. Right off the bat, this did not feel normal. There should have been noises and sounds from the woods around us, and to have it as quiet as a pin dropping, well, it was unusual. As I'm watching my friend's eye, they're focusing off of me and on something behind me, when my friend's face begins to go pale. His jaw starts to drop a little, and I can only feel the dread coming off of him. Let me stop here for a minute. At this point in time, the first thing that ran through my mind was a bear. More specifically, a mother bear with cubs around. I turn around to face the direction my friend is looking, full on expecting a bear to be coming our way. It took me a few seconds to fully take in what I was looking at. About 20 feet away in the brush was this 7 to 8 foot tall creature. The head very much so resembled that of a wolf, with tall pointed ears and a longer muzzle, with deep amber colored eyes. It had a very pissed off expression on its face, and was staring directly at us. One detail I want to point out real quick is it's weird to me that this one's eyes weren't glowing, or even appearing to glow. They were just a deep amber red, kind of like a dark red marble, if that makes any sense. They were haunting, and they are forever burned in my mind. Even now, just thinking about them is causing me to shut down, but I do need to write this out. That was the only Dogman I had ever encountered without glowing eyes. Every other one had some sort of natural glow to them, and I'm not sure why this one didn't. Just wanted to point that out. So, me and my friend are standing there, and we're looking at this thing, and it's looking at us. Between us is thick brush, but there's plenty of room in the brush for us to see each other. I couldn't really see much of its lower half because it was obstructed by bramble, but I saw how big its chest was, the muscles rippling under its defined skin, which seemed to be pulled back almost. I don't know how else to describe it. It was very hairy, thick, long hair. It didn't make any noises, just continued to stare at us. I knew we had to flee, but I know we couldn't just turn around and run. Him and I slowly backed away as far as we could to a point to where we could run, and we did. I'm not a track runner by any means, but we sure as heck made record time out of that forest. We talked about how we both felt what we saw was something that wasn't supposed to exist. My friend was convinced it was a werewolf, but I was skeptical, even though I had even seen it. A living creature, flesh and blood. It wasn't until I had seen these things a couple more times that I started to do my research to find out what it was I was seeing. When I was looking online, I came across something called Dogman and saw that there were so many sightings all over the U.S. Then I started getting into encounters and things like that later on, but at first I just wanted an understanding of what I was seeing. The second time I encountered one, I was by myself, also in Texas, but a different part of the state, far more east. I had made my way to a small creek and was filling up my canteen. I was camped out not far away and was collecting water to boil for myself. As I'm approaching the stream, I noticed that all around me had gone completely silent. The feeling of dread, like what happened last time, circulated in my gut. The memory I hadn't thought about in months comes rushing back to me of that first encounter. Seconds later, I began to feel the presence of something nearby approaching me through the woodline. My gut must have been right, because I started to hear branches breaking and leaves crumpling, accompanied by a very, very low growl. I knew if I went back to my campsite, it would follow me back there, so I went in the total opposite direction of this thing, and it followed me for a good few miles in the woods before it seemed like it disappeared. Maybe it never disappeared. Maybe it kept watching me, but I just didn't know it. At some point, I did make it back to my tent and decided to take everything down and to hike back, even in the dark. I didn't want to risk staying in that area for longer than I had to. Likely it was still at the end of summer, so I had plenty of daylight to work with. The same friend that I had the first encounter with, about a year later, had another encounter himself out towards his older parents' property. His parents had this beautiful gazebo on the far side of their property, followed by trees and brush. They had done several family weddings out there, so it was still fairly decked out florally. Beautiful spot, but my friend says that he saw one walking behind the gazebo one afternoon, back into the woodline. The woods that extend beyond there are over 300 acres and then goes against a mountain. It freaked him out bad, and he doesn't want to go back there anymore. I don't necessarily know what my friend believes, if that's a werewolf or not, but he doesn't like to talk about it much. Some of my encounters were like that though, where I didn't see the Dogman, but I knew he was there, either watching me or waiting to make the right move. I'm not going to go over every single encounter I've ever had, but I will reveal to you the ones that stood out to me. There are still plenty of times to this day that I know they're in the old forest with me, watching me, possibly waiting for the moment to try and get me, but I don't know. I feel like I have been in so many situations in the wilderness by myself where I wasn't the only one there, and I was vulnerable, but had no idea these creatures were even around. It's really scary when you sit and think about it. I'll tell you about another time that I had a bonfire with a girlfriend. This was a few years after my very first encounter, and again in the summertime, but this time in a different state. This was out in the wilderness of Ohio. I was dating this girl who lived out there at the time, and we had made this bonfire out where we were camping. It's late at night, and we're sitting by the fire cuddling, having a conversation, when that good old familiar feeling starts to creep up again, and I notice that the crickets and night noise of nature are now gone. My girlfriend at the time didn't notice because she's still lost in conversation, and probably isn't used to that. I never told her of my initial encounters, and I wasn't waiting to speak up this time because I didn't want to scare her. I just ignored it and kept on talking. I want to say it was maybe a couple of minutes later, I started to notice little glowing balls about 30 to 40 feet away in the trees. I knew what they were. They were eyes. The same eyes on these creatures that I had seen. I was more terrified than my girlfriend would even know, but I hid it because I didn't want her to know about them. So I tried to ignore it. I remember if I changed my posture or change the topic of conversation, but after a while, those eyes weren't there anymore, and at some point, the noises did come back. Like I said, I'm very fortunate that my girlfriend at the time never noticed because she would have went apeshit. I don't know why it was watching me, or if it was even the same creature, but it definitely felt the same with everything else. I've also read of encounters in just about every state, so I already kind of assume that's just what it was. I could go on and on about more encounters that have happened to me, but for the sake of length of this email, I'll try to keep it shorter. The last encounter I had would have been back in February when I was visiting a friend's property who lives far out of town. It had snowed pretty heavily. He does not have hardly if any tree coverage around his house, and it's mostly open. Everything was pretty much covered in snow as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, like a wonderland of winter, if you will. Him and I were sitting on his back porch in the freezing cold. We were enjoying a hot cup of coffee, looking out. This was in the early morning hours, I want to say 5 or 6. It was still dark out, but the sun was just starting to come out, so maybe closer to 6 or 7. I can't remember exactly. My friend points off in the distance and sees this large dog walking from one forested spot to another. To get to this other forested spot, you would have to travel about 60 or so feet of nothing. It's just open clearing. This thing was dark, especially with all the bright snow around and reflecting light. There was nothing keeping it hidden. It had clear as day a large dog-shaped head and pointed ears. There was no hiding that. I knew exactly what it was, and it was the same thing I've been dealing with for years now. It's getting to the point now where I feel so desensitized to these beings anymore. My friend starts freaking out, asking what the hell kind of animal walks upright like that on 2 legs. No dog could ever walk like that. I tried to downplay it and just say it must be some unknown animal. I couldn't possibly have opened up and told him my experiences. God forbid this thing is actually in the area and starts coming after my friend. I never did tell him. The Dogman that I saw trotted off into the other section of woods and was gone. It took its time too, seemed to be in no rush to make it to the tree covering. Of course, it's winter, so all of the leaves were gone, but the trees were thick, and as it entered, you couldn't see where it went. My friend was flabbergasted that he even saw one and wanted to just keep talking about it. I noticed some people's reactions are either that they're terrified that they saw one, or that they're just in total amazement that these beings actually exist. I have a crazy story for you. So, a little bit about me first. My name's Roger. I'm 33, and I am a professional photographer. Primarily portraits that will sometimes do weddings and landscapes, depending on what my client wants. I got picked up by a small design firm to take photography for a hunting game magazine and to do some work for a calendar as well. I travel quite a bit just due to the nature of my work, but this time I traveled out to Minnesota in October last year to get some shots of some big deer. I'm not necessarily an outdoorsy kind of guy, but I do enjoy my casual camping and hiking from time to time. See, I'm a sucker for wildlife photography and landscapes, so this was a fun gig for me. I remember it was really rainy that morning, and I got up early. I'll skip all the boring details about my hike in and finding the clearing in which I did. I had found the perfect spot to do some photography because there was a large herd of deer, probably about 100 to 200 feet away from me. I was able to snag some good shots with my 500mm lens. As I'm watching the deer, I noticed that all of their heads pop up, turn to the left in unison. I wasn't really paying attention to those kind of details, just trying to get all the photography I could, when I start to hear noise like a crashing sound. My automatic response was to look in the direction that they were looking, and to my horror came this massive, hulking black creature on all fours, sprinting at these deer, causing them to break up and flee for their lives. My jaw drops to the ground as I'm watching this behemoth of a thing chase this one poor doe down and tear her to pieces. From my distance, it looked like an oversized wolf or something. As it was tearing into that deer, I was trying to get a good shot of it, but I couldn't, at least nothing definitive. I can get the deer completely in focus, but this shape was just undefinable. I know that probably doesn't make much sense, but it's like the camera just wouldn't focus in on the shape. I've never seen such a thing, and it gave me the creeps. I just had a feeling deep down that it wasn't a natural creature. I don't even think there is such a thing as an all-black wolf that's the size of a horse. I left the area as fast as I could, calling it quits for the day, in hopes to regroup for a different place tomorrow. I had hoped that at least one of the pictures I had of this thing was viable, but a friend I have who is currently studying biology, how to look, and there is really no discernible features that separate it from a bear. It's a damn shame, because it certainly wasn't a bear. It was clearly canine, which is part of the reason I'm confused. The ears and snout gave it away, not to mention the way it ran on all fours. Dogs and bears walk and run very differently, and this was very canine. Anyway, let me know if you want me to send you the picture anyway. Back in January, my girlfriend and I were looking out in the country for some property to purchase. We were looking for acreage and a simple plot of land that we could potentially build on. We were looking for bare bone basics, to have at least power and or a well on it. We had gone scavenging through multiple pieces of property and found one we really enjoyed. This particular piece was about 12 acres on rolling hills with thick patches of forest dispersed throughout randomly. It had a well and septic, but didn't quite have power yet. I figured if we were able to get a fifth wheel on here with a generator, we would be good to go. As my girlfriend and I are walking around the property, checking things out, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that we were being watched. I didn't think much of it, since we're out in the middle of nowhere, and there was really nobody else around. I'm not even sure where there are neighbors, so, to be honest with you, I want you to also know that there was at least a good foot of snow on the ground, so my girlfriend and I were trudging through the snow, checking out the land. Towards the end of us walking around, my girlfriend became really quiet, and her entire demeanor had changed, which is strange because that's not like her at all. My girlfriend is a very talkative social butterfly, and even in weird situations, she's usually the first one to come up with a solution to the problem. She's a natural-born leader, and it's just who she is. One of the reasons why I love her so much, and we connect so well. Anyway, maybe I didn't really notice it or what, but I just thought she wasn't a huge fan of the property. No big deal. We would just keep looking, I thought in my head. We get back to our car, and as we're driving down, she's quiet. Maybe 10 minutes goes by, and I asked her what she had thought of the place and why she was being so weird. She just looked at me with a stern and serious look and didn't say a thing. I thought she might have been pissed off at me, so I asked her what was wrong, and then she asked me if I saw it. I had no idea what she was talking about. Maybe she had reference to the well, and I said I didn't know what you mean. She said, "You didn't see the big wolf that was watching us from the trees?" I'm sure my reaction was puzzled, because I had no idea what she was talking about. She said when we first got there, she noticed it watching us from the tree line off to our right, and that it watched us the entire time we walked around. I wasn't really sure how to respond or know exactly what she was talking about, but then she said that it was the largest wolf she had ever seen in her life. I asked her why she didn't say anything to me, but she said it made her very uncomfortable, and not even the whole time through we were there. She just tried to ignore it, but she could just feel that it was watching us. After some more silence, I told her I felt like something was watching us too, but didn't know that's what it was, since I'm assuming that is what it was. I recall the conversation just ending, like there's animals out there that we don't know anything about, and maybe that's what it was. She got the impression that there was some darkness there. It wasn't just an animal watching us. She said it felt like it was calculating our moves and studying us like an intelligent being would, not just a curious animal. I didn't really know how to respond to that, but I thought I might tell you the story and make of it what you will. Now that I know Dogman exists, could it have been one? I have no idea, but it's coincidental that she mentioned the largest wolf she's ever seen in her life, so I truly don't know. I'm beginning to feel deeply concerned that there might be a Dogman nearby. Let me explain. I live in a small single-wide trailer with large amounts of land between me and any neighbors in my area. A lot of the land around here is heavily used for agriculture and farming, and not too far away is actually a smaller cattle farm where I know there's chickens and pigs. My neighbors directly to the right of me, about a half a mile or so away, have about 5 or 6 horses. I know there's a larger farm directly north of me as well, where I live past a large hill. South of me is a lone road that goes down a small mountain grade, so nothing really down that way except for woods. I have wilderness surrounding my house for most part, giving me some privacy and space between my neighbors and I. It's also very common to see deer, skunks, possums, field mice, owls, all sorts of animals that you get with living out in the sticks. It's kind of my nightly ritual to sit outside on my porch at night and either smoke a cigar, read, or just enjoy the peace and quiet that nature has to offer. It's not uncommon for me to hear coyotes in the background howling. There was a time or two I can recall hearing a mountain lion, but that wasn't any time soon. I've been in the woods long enough and around wildlife to know generally what animals sound like and what they don't sound like. For the past couple of weeks or so, I haven't been hearing the pack of coyotes that I usually do. Instead, it's just this one powerful howl. Before you automatically think it's a wolf howl, I have been out camping before where I was exposed to wild wolves and have heard their noises and howls. This didn't sound like a wolf. It sounded similar in tone and timbre, but it was much, much more deeper and had much more bass. You could tell it came from a larger animal with a much larger set of lungs. It was almost like a scream howl in one, if that makes any sense. It didn't yip and yap like coyotes do. This sounded entirely different. I remember the first time hearing it, it made the hair on my neck and arms stand straight up. I couldn't identify it, and I tried and tried but could not place an animal with that kind of noise. The amount of force and power alone behind this howl was immense. Judging distance, I would say 500 to 700 yards away in the thicket down the canyon just a little ways. For it to be as loud as it was meant the animal had to have been very large. That wasn't the only night I had heard it. Keep in mind I have not heard the coyotes in about 2 to 3 weeks now, and I have been hearing this thing at night. Not every night, but often. It sounds like it's moving around, but it hasn't gotten closer to where I'm living. The very first time I had heard it, it sounded like it was down the grade, just south of me. A few nights later, it was north, closer to my neighbor who owns the cattle farm. I have not talked to any of my neighbors about this or anyone else because I just don't want to sound like I'm crazy. I haven't seen anything or experienced anything unusual for the most part, just normal everyday life. Well, as normal as life can get in quarantine, that is. Now, when I go outside at night, I'm kind of worried that I'm going to hear this thing, or it's going to accidentally trot around on my property. I really don't want to run face to face with whatever is making that scream. I typically don't believe in things that go bump in the night, but this is something on a different level. Something I've never heard before, and something that I can't identify, and that really bothers me. This happened to me when I was just a kid. I think I was about 9 or 10, if I can remember correctly. We used to have this really cool area way back behind our house that had a small creek running through it, that sometimes we would see swan if we were lucky enough, but mainly just had ducks and some small fish here and there. I would go back there often and play a lot, especially during the spring and summertime when things and temperatures started to get really comfortable outside. Sometimes I had to be careful because it would get infested with wasps, and I got stung my fair share of times, but that's besides the point. My dad built me a small tree fort back there with a tiny ladder that I could go into and play. My mom would always make me peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and I would go and take that into my fort and eat it while I watched the creek and enjoyed the solitude of nature and played. This didn't happen a whole lot, but this did happen a few times. The very first time I noticed it was when I was actually eating my sandwich. I heard the sniffing sound like a dog does, and I turned, and the biggest dog I've ever seen in my life was a little bit down the creek, in plain view, sniffing the air, and then turned to look at me. This thing was laying down like it was just relaxing by the creek, no big deal. It did not give up any aggressive or ominous vibes that I can remember. Even as a kid, I remember being hesitant, but I didn't feel any danger, and I kind of chuckled when I first saw him. I thought he was some big black dog that I had never seen before. His size might even be more exaggerated because of the fact that I was a child, but I remember him being freakishly huge. To be honest, he kind of just looked like a black wolf with bigger teeth and amber eyes. I would play in my tree fort, and he would just sit there by the creek, watching me or looking off into the woods. It was weird how I never actually saw him or her, or whatever it was, get up and leave. Same with it being there. I would just look over and he or she was all of a sudden gone, or suddenly there. Being a child, I honestly can't say I really paid too much attention to it getting up and leaving, even if it did, but it just had a lasting impression that it would just reappear or disappear out of nowhere. I never told my parents about it though, and I thought it was strange, but I kind of considered him my friend. I never talked to him, and it never made any noises or anything like that. Just watched me and the creek. I only saw him a small handful of times, and fast forward about 7 or 8 years later, when I was in high school, I remember my friends were telling me about direwolves from a fantasy book and explaining to me how huge they were. Them talking about it immediately brought this memory back of this wolf-like animal that would watch me while I was in my tree fort. I think I tried to tell one of my friends about it, but he quickly dismissed me and explained they don't exist. Fast forward to another 5-10 years, and I first learned about Dogman and the Beast of Bray Road. It kind of caught my interest more, and after hearing the encounters and descriptions of how these things look, I am starting to realize that what I saw those years back by the creek was actually one of these things. I'm a bit confused though, because every encounter I have ever heard is these things are cold-blooded, terrifying killing machines. My experience was so much different. I never got any ominous feelings or vibes at all, and I said I never even noticed the forest going quiet. I had reached out to a Dogman researcher, and he had told me that this thing was possibly waiting and watching me for a vulnerable time to grab me, but I didn't feel like that was the case, honestly. When I felt like this thing would look at me, it was of curious in nature than anything else, and didn't seem like it was intently watching me to stalk me. I knew I was just a child, but there's certain things you can just feel in your gut, and that's one of them. I guess I'm one of the few that has actually had a neutral or positive experience and not negative with these beings. It could be because I respected it and left it alone, and didn't try to mess with it. I have no idea. I'm just trying to make sense of it all.